For 14 years, a small red car drove along the roads of Soviet Belarus. Its driver was a metal worker, a husband, a colleague, even a volunteer helping the police keep order. To most people, he was ordinary. To at least 36 women, he was the last person they ever saw alive. Between 1971 and 1985, in the Vitebsk region of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, women began to disappear. Their bodies were found near highways, in forests and fields around the cities of Vitebsk, Polotsk, Novopolotsk, and nearby rural areas. The pattern was chilling. The victims were found strangled. Many had accepted a ride shortly before they vanished. In villages, mothers warned daughters not to walk alone, yet many had no choice. There were few buses, few cars, and long, dark roads. Rumors spread quickly, but the official story moved slowly. On paper, each killing was an isolated tragedy. In public, the word serial killer sounded like something from Western crime novels, not from the Soviet Union. Investigators opened files, closed files, blamed drifters and outsiders. Innocent men were questioned, pressured, and in some cases even convicted and executed, while the real killer kept driving his red Zaporozhets, sometimes even joining police-organized patrols to search for himself. His name was Gennady Mikhasevich. Known later as the Vitebsk Strangler, he confessed to 43 murders. At least 36 were officially confirmed, and some estimates suggest he may have killed more than 55 women. This is the story of how one man hid in plain sight, how a system designed to control everything failed to control him, and how it finally took more than 500,000 handwriting samples to end his killing spree. Gennady Mikhasevich was born on April 7, 1947, in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, a land still scarred by the Second World War, with villages rebuilt over ruins and families missing fathers and sons. He grew up in a world of shortages and strict expectations. Children were taught to keep their heads down, work hard, and trust the state. Talking openly about anger, humiliation, or obsession was not encouraged. As a young man, he followed a typical Soviet path. He finished school, served in the army, and later worked at industrial plants, including a factory in Novopolotsk. On paper, he looked like millions of others, a worker in an oil refining region, doing his part for the planned economy. But inside, something else was forming. In his early 20s, Gennady fell deeply in love with a young woman. When she rejected him, the humiliation cut deep. According to later accounts, he walked out with a rope, intending to hang himself. At that moment, the violence was aimed at himself. But then his thinking twisted. Later, he would recall a thought that combined self-pity with hatred. Why should I end my own life because of a woman, when I could take a woman's life instead? This was more than a passing impulse. It was the moment he redirected his pain outward. From then on, he no longer saw women simply as partners or companions. He saw them as targets, people he could punish for his own sense of rejection. Outwardly, though, he settled down. He married. He became a father. He started an affair with another woman. He learned how to appear stable, hard-working, and normal, while privately nurturing fantasies of control and violence. The first recognized killing in his series took place in May 1971, near the town of Polotsk. That day, Gennady left home carrying a rope, still thinking about ending his life. On the road, he met a 19-year-old woman walking alone. She accepted his offer of a ride. For her, he looked like a simple driver willing to help, a small kindness on a long walk home. For him, she became an opportunity to test the dark idea that had taken root in his mind. Instead of using the rope on himself, he used it on her. He took her to a secluded place, attacked her, and then strangled her. The first life ended not because of a long-planned scheme, but because one man decided that her life was worth less than his wounded pride. In the months and years that followed, the pattern repeated. His victims were usually women traveling alone, often at night or in the dim light of early morning. Many were near small bus stops, rural crossroads, or paths between villages where cars were rare and streetlights almost non-existent. He presented himself as a helpful stranger, a polite driver offering a lift. In a countryside where hitchhiking was normal and public transport unreliable, refusing a ride could mean walking for hours in darkness. Most women got into the car because it seemed like the safest option they had. Once the woman was inside, he left the main road and drove to a secluded area, a forest track, a dirt lane, a quiet roadside spot screened by trees. There, he sexually assaulted his victim and then used whatever was at hand to strangle her during the attack: a scarf, a belt, a piece of rope. Strangulation during the assault became his repeated pattern. It fused control, violence, and death into a single act that he carried out again and again over the next 14 years. After each murder, he often left the body where it fell, hidden only by darkness or thin cover. At dawn, mushroom pickers, farmers, or passers-by would sometimes discover the victim near a ditch, a field, or a roadside grove. Through the 1970s, the number of such cases slowly grew. A young worker did not return home. A student disappeared after a late shift. A married woman vanished on the way from a bus stop. In small towns and villages, people talked quietly. Women stopped walking alone when they could avoid it. Some husbands insisted on meeting their wives from buses. Others simply hoped that this was happening somewhere else. But official reports framed each case separately. One file here, another there. Different districts, different investigators, different suspects. For years, there was no single map on the wall connecting all the pins. Meanwhile, Mikhasevich built his double life. He changed jobs, moved within the region, and even became a member of the Voluntary People's Patrol, a drużynik, helping police maintain order. The man the community trusted to protect public safety was using that same community's trust to find and attack women. This contrast, helper by day, predator by night, made him almost invisible. He understood local routines, bus schedules, work shifts. He knew when women would be most vulnerable and when no one would be looking for them yet. By the early 1980s, the fear in the Vitebsk area had become a constant background noise. Yet the system still struggled to admit that one man was responsible. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the number of murdered women in the Vitebsk region and nearby areas had become impossible to ignore. Bodies appeared too often in too similar circumstances to be dismissed as isolated crimes. Yet, as later reports admitted, the investigation veered from the right track. Under pressure to show high clearance rates and maintain the image of a safe, well-controlled society, some investigators focused less on truth and more on closing cases. According to subsequent reviews, at least 14 innocent people were convicted for crimes actually committed by Mikhasevich. Some were sentenced to long prison terms. At least one man was executed, another took his own life in custody, and a third reportedly went blind in prison. In several instances, suspects were targeted simply because they happened to be near crime scenes or because they fit a vague description. Under intense interrogation, including physical and psychological pressure, some eventually confessed to murders they had not committed, just to make the torment stop. These miscarriages of justice were not just bureaucratic mistakes. Each false confession allowed the real killer to remain free. While innocent men sat in cells, Mikhasevich continued to drive his red car and look for new victims. Inside the Soviet system, openly admitting that a serial killer had been operating for years in one region meant acknowledging serious failures in law enforcement and public safety. It was easier, politically and psychologically, to treat each murder as a separate case with its own convenient culprit. But not everyone agreed with that narrative. In the early 1980s, an investigator named Nikolai Ignatovich began to re-examine the files of women found near roads and in remote places around Vitebsk. He noticed similarities that others had ignored or explained away. Ignatovich argued that these were not isolated tragedies. He believed that one man, not many, was responsible for a long chain of killings. In other words, he insisted that a serial killer was operating in Soviet Belarus, whether the system liked that idea or not. Around this time, the killer himself added a bizarre new layer to the story. On at least one victim, and, according to some sources, more than one, investigators found a handwritten note. In these notes, the author claimed that a group called the Patriots of Vitebsk was responsible for the murders. This supposed organization of jealous husbands allegedly punished unfaithful women, turning private rage into a collective mission. The concept played on deep social fears, the idea of men banding together to enforce morality on women they considered disloyal. At the same time, it cleverly shifted attention away from a lone predator towards a mysterious group. But the notes did something else, something the killer may not have fully considered. They turned his crimes into documents. Each letter was a physical object that experts could study: the paper, the ink, and, most importantly, the handwriting. Handwriting is a kind of fingerprint. Slant, spacing, pressure, all of it can be measured and compared. Behind the invented organization, Patriots of Vitebsk, there had to be one real person holding a pen. For investigators like Ignatovich, the notes were not just threats, they were clues. If they could match that handwriting to a real citizen, they could finally connect the myth to a man. Once investigators accepted that a serial killer might be behind the murders and that his handwriting could betray him, the scale of their next step was unprecedented. They began collecting handwriting samples from men across the region, especially those whose work or lifestyle put them frequently on the roads. In total, experts examined around 556,000 handwriting samples. It was an enormous, methodical grind, page after page of ordinary words, signatures, and statements, all compared against the few lines written in the killer's notes. This was not fast, glamorous detective work. It was slow, technical, and exhausting. But it was exactly the kind of wide net that only a state with large resources could cast. And eventually, that net closed. Among the hundreds of thousands of samples, they found a striking match: the handwriting of Gennady Mikhasevich. By this time, he was a respected druzhinik, a member of a volunteer people's patrol helping the police maintain order. He wore the armband of a helper. He took part in searches for the very killer he was. He had even been present at scenes connected to his own crimes under the guise of assisting the authorities. When his writing was linked to the killer's notes, investigators did not rely on that alone. They connected his movements to the dates of murders, his access to a red Zaporozhets, and details only the killer could know, such as locations of items he had taken from victims and hidden in wells or remote spots. The case against him solidified quickly. On December 9, 1985, after 14 years of killings, Gennady Mikhasevich was finally arrested in the Belarusian SSR. Under interrogation, Mikhasevich eventually confessed to a long series of murders. Different sources list different numbers, but most agree that he admitted to at least 43 killings, with 36 officially confirmed and some estimates suggesting more than 55 victims in total. He described his method in cold, practical terms. He drove along familiar routes, chose a woman walking alone, offered her a ride, and then took her to a quiet place where the attack ended in her death. Investigators later took him back to some of the crime scenes. He pointed out where he had left bodies and where he had hidden victims' belongings, sometimes in old wells or abandoned structures, confirming details that no one else could have known. Details of the court proceedings in the Soviet press were limited and carefully worded. The official Soviet news agency TASS reported that he had savagely killed dozens of women over many years, and that he was sentenced to death. His case became known across the USSR as the Vitebsk case. It was not only about one serial killer, it also exposed the failings and corruption of law enforcement, the innocent men who had been tortured into confessing, the officials who had been more interested in closing cases than in finding the truth. In the aftermath, some investigators and officials involved in the wrongful convictions were themselves prosecuted and punished. But no verdict could return the lives of wrongly condemned men or of the women whom Mikhasevich killed, while the real pattern was ignored. On September 25, 1987, according to some reports, or early 1988 according to others, Gennady Mikhasevich was executed by firing squad in the Belarusian SSR. The exact date varies across sources, but the result does not. The Vitebsk Strangler was dead. His execution ended his ability to kill. It did not erase what had happened on those roads. The story of Gennady Mikhasevich is not just the biography of a serial killer. It is also a mirror held up to a system that prided itself on control, yet failed to protect its citizens from one man in a red car. For 14 years, he took advantage of trust, routine, and blind spots in both culture and policing. Women accepted rides because they had few safe alternatives. Investigators dismissed the idea of a serial predator because it did not fit ideological expectations. By the time the truth was fully acknowledged, at least 36 women were dead. Some estimates say more than 55. Dozens of families had lost mothers, daughters, and sisters. At least 14 innocent people had been convicted for crimes they did not commit. One man was executed by mistake. Another killed himself in custody. A third went blind in prison. Their suffering is part of the same story. When we talk about serial killers, it can be tempting to focus on the mystery of their minds or the thrill of the chase. But this case reminds us that the real horror lies in how ordinary they can appear and how many chances there are for institutions to fail the most vulnerable. Gennady Mikhasevich did not look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor, a co-worker, a man offering a ride on a cold Belarusian night. That is precisely what made him so deadly. As we revisit his crimes today, the goal is not to glorify him, but to remember the victims and to learn from the mistakes that allowed him to keep killing for so long. Because every time a system chooses convenience over truth, image over reality, someone like him gets more time behind the wheel. This was the story of Gennady Mikhasevich, the Vitebsk Strangler, a man who turned one rejected love into decades of hatred and a state that learned too late what he had done on its roads. In the history of Soviet crime, Gennady Mikhasevich is often mentioned alongside names like Andrei Chikatilo and other serial killers who operated in the late Soviet period. Together, their cases shattered the myth that such predators were only a Western phenomenon or a product of capitalist decadence. For decades, the official line insisted that serious, repeated violent crime was rare in the USSR, and when it did happen, it was quickly punished. The idea that a sexually motivated killer could travel from town to town for years, choosing victims at will, simply did not fit the desired picture of a safe, orderly socialist society. The Vitebsk case shows what happens when an entire system is built around protecting its image. Police were evaluated on clearance rates and solved cases, not on how many lives they actually protected. Every time an innocent man was forced to confess, someone in the hierarchy got a tick in the job done column, while the real killer kept driving at night. Mikhasevich also demonstrates how dangerous normality can look from the outside. He was a husband, a father, a factory worker, a volunteer patroller. He knew how to say the right things, how to show the right face to neighbors and colleagues. There was no neon sign over his head saying "monster." That is one of the uncomfortable truths of true crime. Many of the worst offenders do not look like movie villains. They look like people we already know. The colleague, the neighbor, the man offering a ride on a cold night. So why tell stories like this at all? Not to glorify the killer and not to feed morbid curiosity. Cases like Mikhasevich's matter because they expose weaknesses in institutions that are supposed to protect us, and because they remind us how easily a system can sacrifice truth for statistics and appearances. They also force us to remember the people who are too often reduced to numbers. Behind every victim count were real women with jobs, families, plans, and futures. Behind every wrongful conviction was a man who went to prison, or to his death, for something he did not do. When we look back at the Vitebsk Strangler, we are not just looking at one man's cruelty. We are looking at a chain of small decisions, blind spots, and compromises that allowed him to keep killing for 14 years. If there is a lesson here, it is that ignoring patterns, silencing doubts, and protecting reputations can be just as deadly as the person behind the wheel. In the end, the story of Gennady Mikhasevich is a warning about predators, about systems, and about the cost of denial. It belongs not only to the past of Soviet Belarus, but to anyone who wants to believe that this could never happen here.